Do you think medieval castles were warm? The massive fireplaces we see in movies create the illusion of comfort and security. In reality, they were ice-cold prisons. The huge halls with high ceilings were impossible to heat, and drafts swept through the corridors, chilling even the most noble lords and ladies to the bone. Constant cold was an integral part of life in a castle, affecting everything from daily routines to architectural decisions. The methods used to preserve precious heat may seem primitive to us today, but they allowed people to survive long and harsh winters. These solutions were not just everyday tricks, but a whole system of survival honed over centuries. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary tapestry could be more important than fire, and why beds in the Middle Ages resembled small fortresses. The open hearth in the center of the main hall was the heart of an early medieval castle. It served not only as a source of heat, but also as a place for cooking and the center of social life. Smoke from the hearth rose and escaped through a special opening in the roof called a lucarne. This system was extremely inefficient, as most of the heat escaped along with the smoke. Wall fireplaces, which appeared later, were a real technological breakthrough. They allowed smoke to be removed more efficiently through a chimney built into the wall. However, even these fireplaces only heated a small space directly in front of them. In huge stone halls, the rest of the room remained freezing cold. Fuel consumption was enormous and required constant expense and effort. It took tons of wood every week to heat one large hall. The forests around the castles were rapidly being cut down, making firewood an increasingly expensive and scarce resource. The procurement and delivery of fuel was a constant concern for castle managers. Thus, the fire in the fireplace provided psychological comfort rather than actual warmth. It was a symbol of status and hospitality, gathering the castle's inhabitants around it. But to step away from it meant plunging back into the piercing cold of the stone walls. The main fuel was hardwood, such as oak and beech. These burned slowly and gave off a lot of heat, unlike softwoods. The quality of the firewood was carefully controlled, as the efficiency of the heating depended on it. Wet or rotten wood produced a lot of smoke and little heat. Coal was used less often because of its high cost and delivery difficulties. However, in some regions rich in coal deposits, it became the main alternative to wood. Coal provided more even and longer-lasting heat, but required special braziers. Peat was also used as fuel, especially in marshy areas. It was cheap and readily available, but when burned, it gave off acrid smoke and an unpleasant odor. The use of peat was more of a necessity due to the shortage of quality wood. Controlling the fire required constant attention from the servants. They had to maintain the flame, add wood, and make sure that sparks did not fall on wooden structures. The risk of fire in a castle filled with wooden furniture and fabrics was very high. Cleaning the chimneys was a regular and laborious task. The accumulation of soot could lead to a fire inside the chimney, which was one of the most common causes of fires. This work was dirty and dangerous, but absolutely necessary for the safety of the castle. Despite all efforts, fireplaces could not solve the main problem: thermal insulation. Stone walls several meters thick accumulated cold and slowly released it inside. Even the largest fire could not compensate for these constant heat losses. People understood the inefficiency of such heating and looked for other ways to keep warm. They focused not on producing heat, but on conserving it. It was these methods that allowed them to survive within the cold stone walls. Architects tried to improve the design of fireplaces by making them deeper and equipping them with special reflective surfaces. This slightly increased their efficiency, but did not radically change the situation. The problem of cold in castles remained unsolved for centuries. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think about the inefficiency of fireplaces in huge castles? Write about it in the comments. One of the most effective ways to combat the cold was to use tapestries. These massive woven fabrics were hung on stone walls, creating a barrier against the cold. Tapestries were not just decoration, but a vital element of the castle's insulation system. Tapestries were made of wool, a material known for its excellent thermal insulation properties. The thick woolen fabric did not allow the cold from the stone to pass through and retain the warm air inside the room. The denser and thicker the tapestry, the better it protected against the cold. Tapestries were not hung close to the wall, but at a certain distance from it. For this purpose, special wooden frames or hooks driven into the wall were used. An air gap was formed between the tapestry and the wall, which served as an additional insulator and significantly reduced heat loss. This technology made it possible to turn a cold stone room into a relatively warm and cozy space. Tapestries covered not only the walls, but also door and window openings, preventing drafts. As a result, the temperature in a room hung with tapestries could be several degrees higher than in neighboring rooms.
So cold out here.
In addition to their main function, tapestries also served a decorative purpose. They depicted complex scenes from history, mythology, or everyday life. Bright colors and detailed images enlivened the gloomy interiors of castles and emphasized the status of their owners. Tapestries were very expensive, and only the wealthiest aristocrats could afford them. The process of making one large tapestry could take several years and required the labor of dozens of weavers. Tapestries were considered real treasures and were passed down from generation to generation. Caring for tapestries required special attention. They had to be regularly cleaned of dust that accumulated in the wool fibers. From time to time, they were removed and beaten in the fresh air to prevent the appearance of pests. The materials for making tapestries were carefully selected. Only the best wool, dyed with durable natural dyes, was used. The threads for the base were made of flax or hemp, which ensured the strength and durability of the product. Tapestries could be enormous, reaching several meters in height and length. They were created specifically for the dimensions of a particular hall or room. Sometimes entire series of tapestries were ordered to decorate the entire castle in a uniform style. Transporting tapestries was a difficult task. They were carefully rolled up and packed to protect them from moisture and damage. When a lord moved from one castle to another, he often took his most valuable tapestries with him. Tapestries also helped improve the acoustics in large halls. The soft fabric absorbed echoes, making the space more comfortable for conversation and music. This was an important addition to their primary function of providing insulation. Thus, tapestry was a multifunctional item that combined practicality and luxury. It was an integral part of life in a medieval castle, providing warmth, beauty, and comfort. Without tapestries, life within the cold stone walls would have been much harsher. How difficult do you think it was to create a multi-meter tapestry by hand? But what if the most effective means of insulation was not on the walls, but right underfoot? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of medieval floors. The floors in medieval castles were stone and very cold. To solve this problem, people used a multi-layered covering made of organic materials. This system not only insulated against the cold, but also provided a certain level of comfort and hygiene. The bottom layer of the covering consisted of straw or hay. It was spread in a thick layer directly on the stone floor. The straw created an air cushion that served as an excellent heat insulator and prevented the cold from the stone from penetrating into the room. A layer of fresh herbs and flowers was laid on top of the straw. Plants such as mint, lavender, chamomile, and thyme were used for this purpose. These herbs not only smelled pleasant, but also had antiseptic properties, repelling insects. This layer of herbs was regularly renewed, adding freshness and aroma to the room. The old herbs were not removed, but simply covered with a new layer. As a result, the floor was a multi-layered cake of organic materials, which became thicker over time. This system had its drawbacks. Food scraps and other debris accumulated in the lower layers over time. This created a favorable environment for bacteria and rodents to breed, despite the use of aromatic herbs. Complete replacement of the floor covering was rare, perhaps once or twice a year. It was a big and laborious job that required the efforts of many servants. The entire old layer was removed from the castle and burned, after which a new one was laid. In wealthier homes, carpets could be laid on top of the grass layer. Carpets were a luxury item brought from the East. They not only added warmth and comfort, but also served as an indicator of the owner's high status. The use of reeds or rushes was another alternative to straw. These materials were more durable and long-lasting. They were laid in thick mats that retained heat well and were more pleasant to the touch. In some castles, the floors in the living quarters were made of wood. Wooden flooring was laid on beams, creating an airspace between the floor and the stone base. This was an expensive but very effective solution to the problem of cold floors. Wooden floors were also covered with a layer of grass or carpets. This made them even warmer and more comfortable. Such floors were easier to maintain as they could be washed and waxed. The choice of flooring material depended on the region and the availability of resources. In wooded areas, moss and fir branches were preferred. They also had good insulating properties and a pleasant smell. This living floor system was the result of centuries of experience surviving in cold conditions. It demonstrates how people used available natural materials to create a comfortable environment. It was a simple but ingenious solution for its time. To modern people, such a system may seem unhygienic. However, for the Middle Ages, it was the standard of comfort and cleanliness. The scent of fresh herbs was considered a sign of a well-kept home. Medieval architects understood the importance of proper building orientation for heat conservation. Castles and houses were built to maximize the use of solar heat. This was one of the first forms of passive solar heating. Living areas, such as bedrooms and living rooms, were located on the south side of the castle. During the day, the sun heated the walls and penetrated through the windows, warming the rooms. The north side was reserved for utility buildings, storage rooms, and kitchens, which did not require constant heating. Windows in medieval castles were small and narrow, more like loopholes. Large windows meant significant heat loss, which was impossible to compensate for. The size of the windows was a compromise between the need for light and the need to retain heat. For a long time, windows did not have glass and were closed with wooden shutters. The shutters were tightly fitted to the opening to minimize drafts. At night or in bad weather, they were closed, plunging the room into complete darkness. Glass was a very expensive and rare material. Only the wealthiest monarchs and aristocrats could afford it. Even in their castles, only the windows in the most important rooms, such as private chambers or chapels, were covered with glass. Medieval glass was uneven, cloudy, and had a greenish tint. It did not let much light through, but it was still better than nothing. The glass was inserted into lead or wooden frames to form stained glass windows. Various materials were used to insulate windows. Openings were covered with oiled cloth or finely crafted leather. These materials allowed some light to pass through and protected against the wind, but they were short-lived and required frequent replacement. Internal shutters were another way to reduce heat loss. They were closed at night, creating an additional barrier against the cold. Sometimes a layer of fabric or felt was placed between the outer and inner shutters. The layout of the rooms inside the castle also played an important role. The most important living quarters were placed on the upper floors. Warm air from the fireplaces and hearths on the lower floors rose upwards, providing additional heating. The kitchen was often located in a separate building or wing of the castle to prevent the spread of odors and reduce the risk of fire. However, the heat from the kitchen stoves could be used to heat adjacent rooms, such as servants' quarters. Castle walls were made very thick not only for defense, but also for thermal insulation. Massive stone walls had high thermal inertia. They heated up slowly and cooled down slowly, smoothing out daily temperature fluctuations. This thermal inertia worked both ways. In summer, the thick walls kept the castle cool inside. In winter, once cooled, they became a constant source of cold that was very difficult to heat up. How much do you think the location of the windows affected the overall temperature in the castle? Windows were a source not only of light, but also of cold drafts. In the next chapter, we will learn how people organized their personal space to maximize heat retention. It was impossible to heat the huge halls of medieval castles in their entirety. Therefore, people created smaller, isolated spaces within them. This room-within-a-room strategy allowed heat to be concentrated in a limited area. Heavy curtains and drapes were used to divide large halls. They were made of thick woolen fabric or velvet. These curtains were hung from the ceiling to the floor, separating small corners for work, rest, or sleep. Such improvised rooms were much easier to heat. Inside, you could put a brazier with coals or simply warm yourself with the heat of human bodies. The air in the partitioned space was significantly warmer than in the rest of the hall. The private quarters of the lord and his family, called solars, were relatively small. They were easier to heat and often had their own fireplace. The solar was the warmest and most comfortable room in the entire castle. The solar was usually located on the top floor, above the main hall. This allowed the heat rising from below to be used. In addition, there were fewer drafts and less dampness on the upper floors. The furniture in the rooms was arranged with heat conservation in mind. Beds, tables, and chairs were placed away from the cold exterior walls. They were placed closer to the fireplace or in the center of the room. The high backs of chairs and armchairs protected those sitting from drafts. Sometimes the furniture was additionally draped with fabric, creating another layer of insulation. People tried to surround themselves with warm materials on all sides. Even the location of the main hall was important. It was the center of social life and, as a rule, the most crowded place in the castle. A large number of people gathered together generated a significant amount of heat. During the day, the castle's inhabitants tried to spend more time together in the common hall. At night, they dispersed to their small, better insulated bedrooms. This was a rational way to use heat and space. Portable braziers were used for additional heating. They could be placed in any part of the room where more heat was needed. However, braziers were dangerous due to the risk of fire and carbon monoxide poisoning. The use of screens was another way of zoning the space. Wooden screens covered with fabric or leather effectively protected against drafts. They could be easily moved around, creating cozy corners in the large, cold hall. Castle architecture gradually evolved towards the creation of more small rooms. Late medieval castles had a more complex layout with many private rooms. This reflected a growing need for privacy and comfort. Thus, medieval people did not try to heat the entire castle. They created localized areas of warmth using furniture, fabrics, and architectural solutions. This pragmatic approach allowed them to survive in conditions of constant cold. In conditions where it was practically impossible to heat a huge and echoing stone dwelling, the focus shifted from heating the space to heating the person. Personal warmth became an absolute priority, and comfort was not a given. It had to be actively created and maintained. Medieval clothing and bedding were not just everyday items, but a carefully thought-out, multi-layered system of personal insulation. This system turned each person into a self-sufficient unit, surrounded by their own microclimate. It was a real personal fortress made of fabric, fur, and feathers, which people wore during the day and hid in at night, reflecting the attacks of the omnipresent cold. The basis of this personal fortress was the principle of layering, which is used today by mountaineers and polar explorers. Each layer of clothing did not so much provide warmth on its own as create a thin layer of air between itself and the next layer. It was this still air trapped between the layers of fabric that was the main insulator, forming an invisible barrier against the cold. The system began with the bottom layer, an undershirt known as a camisa. Over the linen shirt, one, and in severe cold, 2 or even 3 woolen tunics of different lengths were worn. Wool was a strategic material in medieval Europe, the main means of combating the cold. Its unique properties lay in the structure of its fibers, which even in tightly woven fabric created myriad air pockets that retained heat. Protecting the feet was no less important as the cold rose up from the stone floors. Men wore stockings called hose, which were also made of thick wool. They fit tightly around the legs from the feet to the thighs, leaving no gaps for cold air to enter, and were attached to the belt with special garters. Footwear was mainly leather, but its design took into account the need for insulation. So-called pattens were often used. Wooden platform sandals that were worn over leather shoes for walking on the street. They raised the foot above the icy ground, mud, and snow, keeping the main shoes dry and protecting the feet from freezing. Outerwear was the final, most powerful layer of protection. Long and wide cloaks, capes, and mantles made of heavy, thick cloth were a must-have item in any wardrobe. Their cut allowed you to wrap yourself completely in them, like a portable blanket. creating another voluminous layer of insulating air. For the nobility and wealthy townspeople, cloaks were often lined with fur, which made them incredibly warm and prestigious garments. Squirrel, rabbit, marten, or beaver fur not only retained heat excellently, but also demonstrated the wealth and high social status of the owner. Realizing that a significant amount of heat is lost through the head, people in the Middle Ages almost never went bareheaded. Headwear was an integral and mandatory part of the wardrobe for both men and women, and was worn not only outdoors but also indoors. Men wore skull caps, caps, and various hoods, which were often part of an upper tunic or cloak. When night fell, the bed became the main and final refuge from the cold. A medieval aristocrat's bed was not just a piece of furniture, but a monumental, almost architectural structure. Made of solid oak, it had 4 tall carved posts supporting a solid wooden canopy. On all 4 sides, this frame was draped with several layers of thick, heavy curtains made of wool, cloth, or even velvet. When the curtains were drawn, they turned the bed into a small bedroom within a bedroom, completely isolated from the cold room. The air inside this fabric cocoon, which was incomparably smaller than the volume of the entire room, quickly warmed up from the heat of the bodies and breath of the sleepers. The bed itself was also a multi-layered system. The base was a mattress stuffed with whatever materials were available: straw for the poor, horsehair or wool for the wealthy. The height of luxury was considered to be feather beds stuffed with swan or goose down. They were incredibly soft and warm. Special warmers were used to combat the initial coldness of a damp bed. The simplest option was smooth river stones or bricks, which were heated in the fireplace, wrapped in thick cloth, and placed under the blanket. A more advanced device was a metal bed warmer, a copper or brass vessel with a lid and a long handle. Even in their sleep, people continued to protect themselves from the cold. An essential part of nightwear was a sleeping cap, which protected the head from heat loss. Often, people did not undress completely, but slept in their undergarments, and sometimes, on particularly cold nights, in some of their daytime clothes. Moreover, in order to conserve heat, the practice of sleeping together was widespread. Not only spouses but also other family members could sleep in the same bed, warming each other. Thus, clothing and bedding in the Middle Ages were not just things, but the last and most reliable line of defense against the cold. They were a complex, multi-layered system that created an individual microclimate around each person, allowing them to survive the long winter months in an unheated stone castle. How comfortable was it to move around and work in such bulky, multi-layered clothing? It certainly restricted movement, but that was the price paid for survival. In the next chapter, we will look at how portable heat sources helped in the local fight against the cold. Braziers were an important addition to stationary fireplaces. They were metal or ceramic bowls on legs, into which hot coals were poured. The main advantage of braziers was their mobility. They could be carried from room to room. This allowed local heat sources to be created exactly where they were needed at any given moment. A brazier could be placed near the table during a meal or next to the chair where the Lord was conducting business. This was much more effective than trying to heat the entire room at once. Charcoal was used as fuel for braziers. Unlike ordinary firewood, charcoal burned with virtually no smoke or flame. This made it relatively safe to use indoors without a chimney. However, the use of braziers was associated with a serious danger. When coal burned, it released carbon monoxide, colorless and odorless, but deadly. Rooms where braziers were used had to be well ventilated, which negated part of their heating effect. Braziers were made from various materials. The simplest ones were ceramic, while the more expensive ones were made of bronze or iron. They were often decorated with intricate patterns, turning a utilitarian object into a work of art. The sizes of braziers also varied. Small handheld braziers could be held in the hands to warm them. Large floor braziers could heat a small group of people gathered around them. There were also special braziers for warming beds. They had a long handle and a lid with holes. Hot coals were placed inside, and this frying pan was passed between the sheets before bedtime. Braziers required constant care. The coals had to be lit outside or in the fireplace and only then brought indoors. After use, the ashes had to be carefully removed so as not to stain the floors and furniture. Despite all the risks and inconveniences, braziers were an indispensable element of medieval life. They provided flexibility and heat management that stationary fireplaces could not offer. It was a simple but effective solution for local heating. In large halls, several large braziers were sometimes installed. They created islands of heat around which life was concentrated. People moved from one brazier to another, trying to stay within their range. Braziers were also used in churches and monasteries. In huge unheated temples, they were the only source of heat for priests and parishioners during long winter services. Thus, braziers played a key role in the survival strategy in cold castles. They made it possible to heat people rather than spaces, which was a much more rational approach. The kitchen was one of the warmest places in the entire castle, a true center of heat. Huge stoves and hearths worked there from early morning until late at night, generating a tremendous amount of thermal energy. This energy, although unintentional, contributed to the heating of the entire castle. For fire safety reasons, the kitchen was often built as a separate building, connected to the main castle by a covered passageway. This prevented the spread of fire to the living quarters. However, this arrangement reduced its effectiveness as a source of heat. In later castles, the kitchen was built directly into the main building, usually on the first floor. This was riskier, but it allowed the heat from the kitchen stoves to be used more efficiently. The walls adjacent to the kitchen were always warm. Warm air from the kitchen rose up the stairs and corridors, heating the upper floors. The rooms directly above the kitchen were the warmest in the castle after the rooms with fireplaces. Often, servants' quarters or guest bedrooms were located there. The constant work in the kitchen required a large amount of fuel. The wood supplies for the kitchen were comparable to those for heating the main hall. This made the kitchen not only the center of food preparation, but also the largest consumer of energy in the castle. In addition to heat, the kitchen was a source of constant activity. There was always a lot of work going on there, and many people gathered there. This activity and human warmth also contributed to a more comfortable atmosphere. The smells of food being prepared, spreading from the kitchen, created a feeling of comfort and well-being. In a cold and gloomy castle, the aroma of fresh bread or roasted meat was a powerful psychological factor. It was associated with warmth, satiety, and safety. Sometimes the heat from the kitchen was used deliberately. For example, bathrooms could be located next to the kitchen. Hot water for washing was taken directly from the kitchen boilers, and the room itself was heated by the warmth from the adjacent wall. Servants working in the castle often looked for an excuse to go into the kitchen and warm up a little. For them, it was the only place where they could take a break from the piercing cold of the corridors and halls. The kitchen was an informal center of social life for the servants. Architects took this factor into account when designing castles. The location of the kitchen in relation to the living quarters was an important decision that affected the overall thermal balance of the building. A successful layout could significantly improve living conditions in the castle. Even the chimneys from the kitchen stoves could serve as a source of heat. Passing through the thickness of the walls, they gave off some of their heat to the stone, which then slowly radiated it into adjacent rooms. It was a primitive form of central heating. Thus, the kitchen was not only a place for cooking, but also the castle's informal boiler room. Its constant operation provided a basic level of heat that made life within the stone walls a little more bearable. In addition to all the technical tricks, the human factor played an important role in the fight against the cold. Medieval people understood that the best source of heat was another person. Social habits and daily routines were largely subordinated to the task of conserving heat. Most of the time, the castle's inhabitants spent together in the common hall. This was not only a tradition, but also a practical necessity. A large group of people gathered in one room generated enough heat to make it more comfortable. Shared meals, celebrations, and entertainment were not just leisure activities, but a means of collective survival. Dancing, games, and music warmed not only the soul, but also the body. Physical activity was the best way to keep from freezing in the cold hall. The population density in the castle was quite high. In addition to the lord's family, a large number of servants, craftsmen, and soldiers lived in the castle. Their constant presence and movement created additional warmth. Even domestic animals contributed to the heating. In some cases, small livestock could be brought into the lower rooms of the castle for the winter. The heat from the animals rose upward, warming the floors on the upper floors. The working day was structured according to daylight hours and temperature. The heaviest and most energy-intensive work was done during the coldest part of the day to keep warm. Evenings were spent in relative peace by the fire, conserving energy and heat. The psychological aspect of warmth was also very important. The feeling of community, security, and belonging to a group helped people endure physical discomfort. Overcoming difficulties together strengthened social bonds. Hospitality was not only a virtue, but also a way to attract more people to the castle, and accordingly, more warmth. Large feasts and receptions were a demonstration of status and at the same time, a collective warming session. Stories and legends told by the fireplace created a cozy atmosphere. They distracted from the feeling of cold and brought people together. The fire in the hearth was the center of not only physical, but also social warmth. Behavioral norms were also adapted to the cold conditions. It was considered normal to sit close to each other and share a cloak or blanket. Physical contact was a natural way to keep warm. Children spent most of their time playing games that required movement. Their activity helped them stay warm. Games of tag or hide-and-seek in the cold corridors of the castle also had a practical purpose. Thus, social structure and daily habits were closely intertwined with the need to stay warm. People instinctively and consciously used collective energy to combat the cold. Ideas about comfort in the Middle Ages were radically different from the modern standards we take for granted. For medieval people, constant cold, penetrating dampness, and drafts were not annoying inconveniences, but a norm of life that had to be tolerated and adapted to. The ability to endure low temperatures without complaining and remain productive was seen not only as a personal trait, but also as an important sign of physical strength, endurance, and excellent health. It was part of the toughening process that shaped the mentality of the era. However, humanity does not stand still, and over the centuries, albeit slowly but surely, heating and insulation technologies have developed. This process was non-linear and often reactive, responding to people's needs for better living conditions. Gradually, from era to era, austere, functional castles and dwellings underwent transformations, becoming warmer, brighter, and, as a result, more comfortable to live in. This long and laborious process reflected profound changes taking place in society as a whole. Technological development, increased prosperity, changing social priorities, and the formation of new ideas about privacy and personal comfort. One of the most revolutionary and key innovations that changed the very paradigm of living space was the widespread use of glass. Until the late Middle Ages, windows were either absent or small loopholes covered with shutters, oiled cloth, or animal bladders, which made rooms dark and cold. When glass production technology reached a level where it became possible to manufacture fairly large, and most importantly, relatively airtight glass panels, it caused a real revolution. Large windows fitted with glass radically changed the thermal balance of buildings. Not only did they allow significantly more daylight into rooms, but they also allowed passive use of solar heat to warm the interior. Instead of being a source of drafts and darkness, windows became a source of light and heat. The design of fireplaces, which had long remained primitive and extremely inefficient, also underwent significant improvements. More complex and sophisticated chimneys appeared, often with bends and dampers, which were much better at retaining heat inside the room, directing smoke outside and preventing it from escaping freely along with precious heat. An important step was not only an increase in efficiency, but also the spread of fireplaces. Whereas previously a fireplace was a luxury and often the only source of heat in the main hall, over time they began to be built into every living room, which allowed for individual, local comfort and significantly increased the overall temperature in private quarters. At the same time, the architecture of castles itself changed. From purely defensive structures, where functionality and inaccessibility were paramount, they gradually transformed into more livable and representative residences. There were significantly more small, intimate rooms, which were much easier to heat than huge, echoing halls. The number of private rooms for members of the Lord's family and his guests increased, allowing everyone to have their own personal, warmer, and more secluded space. In the late Middle Ages, and especially during the Renaissance, when engineering thought gained new momentum, the first, still tentative but ambitious attempts to create central heating systems appeared. In some particularly luxurious castles and palaces, complex systems of channels and air ducts were installed. through which hot air, heated by large furnaces in the basement, was supplied to the living quarters. These systems were essentially a reimagined and adapted version of the ancient Roman hypocaust, a system for heating floors and walls. However, these early central heating systems were incredibly expensive to build, required enormous amounts of fuel, and were extremely difficult to operate and maintain. Due to their high cost and technical complexity, they did not become widespread and remained the privilege of only the wealthiest and most powerful rulers and aristocrats. Nevertheless, they were an important harbinger of the future, pointing the way in which engineering thought and man's quest for the most efficient and comprehensive heating of dwellings would develop. Attitudes towards clothing also changed. While in the early Middle Ages the main criteria were strength, durability, and above all, warmth, with the development of trade and the emergence of new fabrics, clothing became lighter, more refined, and more elegant. Nevertheless, it still retained its basic heat protective properties thanks to the use of high-quality wool, fur, and multiple layers. New styles appeared, whose cut allowed functionality to be combined with fashion trends, reflecting the growing importance of appearance and aesthetics. This continuous evolution of comfort continues to this day. Modern complex heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, which allow you to maintain the ideal temperature and humidity in any climatic conditions, are the direct result of a 1,000-year-long, tireless search by humans for ways to protect themselves from the vagaries of nature and ensure the most comfortable existence possible. We have completed our journey into the cold and uncomfortable world of medieval castles. Today we learn that life in these stone giants was a constant struggle for warmth. Fireplaces were inefficient, and drafts swept through the huge halls, making them virtually uninhabitable in winter. However, people found solutions that were ingenious in their simplicity. Tapestries on the walls, multi-layered floors made of grass, thoughtful architecture, and zoning of space helped to preserve precious heat. Multi-layered clothing and fortress-like beds created a personal microclimate, while social rituals and spending time together warmed not only bodies, but also souls. These methods show how inventive people can be in their quest for comfort and survival. They are proof that even in the harshest conditions, it is possible to find a way to create your own little island of warmth and comfort. What other topics from medieval life would you like to see in our next issues? Perhaps you are interested in medieval medicine, the justice system, or the secrets of the knightly orders? Share your ideas in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new exciting stories.